Well, welcome everyone to Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching podcast brought to you by the Joint Public Issues team. My name is Matt Forsyth, and once again, your host for Politics in the Pulpit for this season. But as always, I'm glad that I'm not alone and I have guests with me that come along for the journey and explore our lectionary readings for this coming week. I wonder how your week has been so far. And as you've delved into the lectionary readings that we have for us for politics in the pulpit, I wonder what's coming to mind now. But as I said, I'm glad that I'm not alone in as we reflect on these lectionary readings for this coming Sunday. I'm delighted to have two guests with me today. First, we have Catriona Robertson, who is joining us today. Catriona has an amazing history in regards to her working life and engagement in many things, not least former director of Christian Muslim Forum, but also has worked extensively in public policy and interreligious work over the last 25 years, and also been more recently community warden at the Iona Abbey, which I'm quite interested to hear more
Mhm.
about as well. But Catriona, welcome to Politics in the Podcast. Great to have you.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And it's good to have you, Katrina. Thank you. And also, for the first time joining us in Politics in the Pulpit, like Katrina, we have Steve Summers, who is the head of community engagement for the United Reformed Church. Steve, welcome to your first innings here at the Politics in the Pulpit podcast.
Thank you very much, Matt. Good to be
It's,
here.
it's good to have you both. And it's been quite a week before we go into some of the important dates coming up, and indeed some of the news pieces that I've kind of been pressing, and no doubt many of you will know many of those news items we might refer to. But let's get to know, I guess, a little bit more. Let's get to know you first, Katrina, a little bit more. I gave a brief introduction there, about some of the things you've been up to, but tell us a little bit more about kind of what you're up to now. And kind of where your passions lie in terms of whether it be interreligious work or other matters as well. Kind of where do your passions and interests align right now in terms of your activity?
I guess I've always been interested in how we get along together with with difference, how different people get along together, or different communities get along together, different parts of the world get along together, without having to be the same. So how can we retain our differences and yet understand each other better, are curious about each other, enjoy each other's company, can work well together. So as you mentioned, Matt, I've been in the interreligious world for a long time, mainly at the local level, actually, between churches and mosques and temples and gurdwaras and synagogues and so on, and linking that into public policy and mental health and policing and all that kind of thing. Um, but a few years ago, I was, for I think about 5, 6 years, the director of the Christian Muslim Forum, one of the national groups. Um, and it's hard, it's tough, it's interreligious stuff. It's no longer a kind of cool thing to be involved in because it's really hard and it's quite political. It brings in all kinds of. It's not really just about religion, but it is about what's going on in the world and inequalities and where we are in history. There's a lot that comes into it, but at its heart, it's people, it's human beings. And I love all that, and I'm still involved, and especially since the horrific attacks on Israel by Hamas on October the 7th, and the retaliatory action into Gaza by Israel that has its knock-on effects in this country. And so I've been a little bit involved in conversations between people who are affected by that on all sides, and that's hard stuff. Um, but you mentioned Iona Abbey, and
Mhm.
I did go up, and I was warden of the Abbey for a few years, and that's intention living in intentional community. So that's day to day. How do we do this thing? If you've, we used to pray together, eat together, have meetings together. So there's a lot of together stuff, um, and it's a real kind of. I think for me, it was a lesson in how to love and how to be loved, um, with the most unexpected people. And we
Yeah.
used to have visitors come. week by week. So there'll be lots of people coming from all over the world. Um, so how do you do that thing where you can't just switch someone off, or just say, actually, I don't want to continue with that conversation. You absolutely have to grapple with it and go deep. So it's a deep way of living, and I absolutely loved it. But it's something that people only do for just a few years. It's quite intense, and
Well,
so
and I can
my
imagine,
my
I can imagine,
time
but
is done.
it's about people though, isn't it? In all of those kind of threads, reflecting back and kind of listening to some of your story, it's been about that intensive working with people, but for seasons of time, it feels like, isn't it? Like, whether it be an interfaith dialogue and conversation, or in that thin space of Iona Abbey, it's having those intentional moments of being with people, and I think that might come out a little bit more in our lecture readings a little bit later on about being with people. And I think there's probably a bit of a thread there to your role, Steve, too, talking to people, talking about engagement. What's head of community engagement look like at the United Reformed Church, I wonder? Tell me a bit more about that, Steve.
Yes, thank you. But thank you first of all, Catriona, for what you've just described, because I think what we've got in common is this passion and practice for community building. So very much in my role, I have the real pleasure and privilege of going all around the United Reformed Church, seeing churches, individuals who are already engaged in their neighborhoods, in their communities, in partnerships, very key, as far as possible welcoming people, whoever they are, to be inclusive as possible. So I see, incredible examples of churches, really working alongside people where it matters most. Um, I think more and more, there's dangers that people are excluded for many reasons, and in the United Reformed Church, we try as hard as we can, as much as community building allows, to work, with anybody and anywhere. I'm a youth and community worker by profession, so I guess I'd say that. But it is about, how do we put our faith into practical actions? How can people see the hope that we believe in practical ways? But yeah, no, I look forward to this conversation because I think it is how we really link together both the practical and working together for peace and justice in many ways.
Absolutely. There's a doing action there, and I think we'll kind of get onto that as we go forward in this Politics in the Pulpit podcast. But before we go any further, as well, we want to encourage those that are listening right now, if you've not done so already, to subscribe to our podcast. We'd love you to receive the podcast weekly as we bring you more Politics in the Pulpit content. So do make sure you subscribe if you haven't done so already, or you can jump over to our YouTube channel. You can go to the Joint Public Issues team YouTube channel and watch us have this conversation now. There's something I think really helpful sometimes when you can see our faces maybe talking to one another, not just listening to us. So maybe you want to try that for the very first time if you've not done that already, and you can always get involved with us as well. But of course, we do have what has been quite a week when it comes to news items in particular. Of course, we are still hot off the heels of the US election results. When we recorded last week, we thought we might not know even what the election result might be, but my goodness, we knew pretty quickly, didn't we, by the end of it? Of course, as we're recording, it's Armistice Day today, but we would have also, in the context of that, reflect on the continuing wars across the world that are happening. There's, of course, the fallouts of the devastating floods that happened in Spain, and that's also then relating very um, poignantly to COP29 meeting in Baku in Azerbaijan too, and recognizing that the Joint Public Issues team has put out resources and also encouragement to engage with COP29 as well as it begins as well this week. Not only that, but also important dates for us to think about too. Maybe is not just maybe, but definitely is Interfaith Week is the 11th of November to the 18th of November, and of course, I think Katrina, you might want to touch a bit on that in particular. World Toilet Day is this week. You might not know that, but if you have maybe twinned your toilets or celebrating what you can do there, World Toilet Day is the 19th of November. And then we also have International Transgender Day of Remembrance on the 20th of November too. And there's a number of other days we might want to highlight too. But there's lots happening to say in our world and in our week ahead. But that allows us to come to our lectionary readings where we have three lectionary readings to reflect upon. And we might touch on some of them, might touch on just one or two of them. We'll see how the conversation takes us. But we have our 1 Samuel chapter 1 verses 4 to 20 reading, our Hebrews chapter 10 reading, and that takes us from verse 11 pretty much to verse 25. And then our Mark's reading, Mark's Gospel chapter 13, 1 to 8. But before we go into those lecture readings, Catriona, I wonder if you can answer the question, and I'm presuming assuming the answer is yes, politics should be in the pulpit. Why do you think politics should be in the pulpit? Or maybe you don't think it should be at all. I don't know. Let me know, Catriona. What do you think? Politics in the pulpit, yay or nay, and why?
Well, yay, yay. Um, the Iona Community, which I'm still part of the life of the Iona Community, has a little thing about prayer and politics, work and worship, and the sacred and the secular. That these things come together, and they're not to be pulled apart. Um, and if you look at the Bible, it's absolutely stuffed full of politics, to my mind. But I think it does depend. I think that question maybe comes from different places and different people. And I think there is such a disengagement with politics with some people for all kinds of different reasons. Um, and politicians have a bit of a bad rap and so on. So I think it's worth just sort of inquiring a little if somebody says that to you, well, what are you doing putting politics in the pulpit? And to say and to ask why not. But to my mind, politics is, it's how we live our lives. It's how we live our lives, quite small scale to internationally. And God loves us. God loves the world. God cares, and it comes through the readings. God cares about what happens and what our decisions are and how we come to those decisions.
Absolutely. That's really helpful for us and a helpful challenge too for those of you listening. If you hear possibly where, people say actually politics shouldn't be in the pulpit, it's asking sometimes that bold question, tell me more, tell me more. Why do you think that? And invite that conversation and to explore that question at the heart of why. We're going to go into our readings now that we know that politics should be in the pulpit, so we can go on as a yes, which is an encouragement. So it means I think we can have this kind of engagement dialogue around these lectionary readings in particular. So I wonder, Steve, if you want to kick us off, is there kind of a particular passage of the three that stand out to you? Is there one of a theme that stands out to you? Kind of what was your first reflections as you read those lectionary readings that we were given for this coming Sunday?
I think my first response is, wow, there's so much in each of them. Um, I think the first one, the Samuel one, connected and resonated the most with me. The books of Samuel, I think, are so important and illustrative of a developing nation, both from a theocracy with Eli and Samuel as the last of the judges in charge, and then move into monarchy with King Saul and David onwards. But it's told mainly through the stories of individuals, mainly the men, of course, who are recorded. But here we begin with Hannah. She's
Mm.
the most significant person in this story here. She's called a barren woman, not a nice term in itself, but in the day she'd have been regarded as someone who'd failed in a sense, a social embarrassment to her husband, a horrific sort of judgment on her. But as I emphasize, this is where it all begins with Hannah. And in the book as well, you've got story of Samuel, the young Samuel, thinking it was Eli rather than God calling him in the night, which is a lovely story, that I can remember from many years back. But it speaks of how we all have a vocation and a calling, particularly young people have a calling, and
Yeah.
that intergenerational relationship between Eli and Samuel, which is crucial. But as I said, I'd never really noticed this opening passage to do with Hannah. It's the rest of the books that I guess I'd heard more about. And when I first read it, it spoke quite personally. It made me sort of internally gasp and jolt. Um, and as much as possible as a man ever can feel empathy with Hannah's situation, it did a little. We've happily got 4 children now, born over 4 different decades, and that might be a podcast for another time. But there was a time when we unsuccessfully went through IVF treatments and all the emotional roller coaster that involved. Only for our youngest child now to be conceived, many years later. So I think what I'd like to emphasize for people listening to this sermon is that there may well be sort of quite a traumatic passage for them, and there might be some emotional feelings about it if they haven't had or can't have children. And maybe there needs to be a pastoral posture and perspective in the sermon this week.
Yeah. I
Mm.
think that's really helpful, and thank you, Steve, for kicking us off there with that, and especially your personal story coming through there. And before I kind of bring you in, Catriona, about that, as well in terms of some of those opening thoughts from Steve, I think certainly, I think one of the things that you sometimes people I think have become more aware of, especially when they're, when you think about social media, for example, that there's so many things about social media that can be really difficult and hard.
Mm, mm,
But one of the things that I've deeply appreciated from people that I still have on my social media accounts is that I think the awareness when they're putting things up, even when it's good news to them, but recognize
mm,
that it might be bad news for someone else. Not bad
mm,
news, but might be internally taken in a different kind of way. So they might put, a trigger warning. And you say that very literal as they kind of engage with their fan base or followers and friends, but they recognize that actually that it could be that news could land differently to someone
mm,
else. And we always have to recognize that in our preaching, don't we? That what we say might land differently elsewhere. But I think certainly there is that pastoral kind of trigger warning. I think that I feel like at the very beginning we have to be aware of that. And especially, speaking from a context, but I'm often preaching in a Methodist context where the age range of those that are in the life of our church are possibly on the more elderly part of phase of their life. And what would be really important is to be aware that actually, though people might be in a certain part of their life, doesn't mean they haven't. We forget maybe they've lived earlier parts of their life that might have had traumatic experiences that they've never actually spoken about. Um, I'm grateful that we are now more aware of a child loss or those that can't have children. But I feel like there's generations where that would have been not spoken about in the same way. So, Steve, thank you for kind of beginning us on that track. And I wonder, Katrina, is there anything that you'd want to add about that or other
I,
than what Steve shared about that Samuel reading?
I thought even having just to say something in preaching takes place in lots of different ways, and in pulpits and out of pulpits and so on, but just to offer a listening space
mm,
maybe at the end of the service and just say, uh, you know I or other people would be there to talk over any of the stuff that has come up in the readings, even if they don't listen to the sermon at all, they might be listening to the readings. But no, really interesting what you were saying, Steve. I focused on with this particular reading, the conversation between Eli and Hannah. And Hannah has just kind of been ignored. Her husband's other wife has been lording it over her and doesn't really see why she's so miserable, upset. She's not even eating properly. Her husband is saying to her, you don't have children, but am I not worth 10 sons to you or something? Sort of not really hearing it. And then Eli, she goes to the temple and goes and puts herself in God's presence, pours her heart out. And even Eli, sort of sitting a little bit away, thinks, what's this woman up to? She must be drunk. And
mm,
so he comes in with another thing. And I think, oh, goodness, Hannah. And yet she has somewhere from inside, she comes back, she has that courage and says straight to Eli, what's going on? I'm pouring my heart out to the Lord. And it's there's a change there. And and Eli, he kind of gets it, and he's not intrusive. He doesn't ask what she's pouring her heart out to the Lord. And I feel that Hannah at that point was seen, was believed, was acknowledged.
Mm.
There was a real change happened within her, and something happens as a result of it. That Eli says, "I will, I will pass on what you request. I will take that up as a prayer myself, as I understand it." And then it's quite delicately worded what happens afterwards. But anyway, she goes back. They eat and drink together. So, and I think it's, what does it say? Her countenance was sad no longer.
Mm.
And I think, this tiny little conversation, and how that can create a change.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the thing that came out from that reading. And then of course her song afterwards, Hannah's song, which I think we'll probably come on to this, but it reminded me very much of Mary's song, of justice and turning things upside down to to have justice and peace in the world. And I did think I'm sure many of us were talking to friends after the result of the US election last week. And I, for one, I thought, strangers in a strange land. I think things are shifting. The tectonic plates here are shifting, and especially with politics in Europe, which I'm quite interested in, and the shift in Germany and France and Italy, and not just Hungary, but the Netherlands and Sweden as well. A world order that I've been used to is definitely changing. But then I turned to Mary's song and read that, and that kind of, I'm going to sing out whatever. I'm going to sing out. And this is the world that God wants, and I'm going to be part of that. So Hannah gets this strength from this, which is written about in this story. I was quite taken with that.
I think Mary's Magnificat is a great link to be making. I think in this context of Hannah's song, and there's something of a posture that we see both from the first chapter to the second chapter of 1 Samuel. We see a shift, that posture of Hannah, which I feel is so profound, and in the midst of circumstances that feel difficult and hard, that posture is so, I think, poignant for us to reflect on, because we often want to have the answers when those tectonic shifts our plates are moving. We want to have certainty and to know the answers, but actually we don't yet know. But nevertheless, the posture of prayer and the posture of faithfulness, but also of hope, that kind of can come through at this season, seems so powerful and needed, I dare say. Steve, kind of picking up on what Catriona's just saying there, what's sort of picking up for you as further reflections, I guess, on this scripture, or is there ways which you would kind of, you said about making it practical? Is there ways that you'd want to make it practical to people to engage with? I wonder.
Well, I think one other thing to sort of ponder is the theme about sacrifice, both in this and the Hebrews
Mm.
reading, and doing God's will. Hannah had craved so long for this child, but she sacrificially gave Samuel up to do God's work as she has promised. Samuel means because I asked the Lord for him, yet she kept her promise back to God and gave him away in a sense. I mean, all parents we have to at some point, but Samuel was quite young, and God's timing. So I hadn't realized again until more recently that she'd had to wait so long to conceive and all the distress that would have involved. But if Samuel had been born earlier, obviously Eli wouldn't have perhaps been the wise old man that he is when we encounter the story. So God's timing in that story, I guess, part of it as well. I mean, practically, I'd really like to shout out for the Home for Good and Safe Families Organisations initiative. And
Mm,
that's for churches and individuals to really consider fostering or adoption or providing supported lodgings.
mm,
I was at the relaunch of Northamptonshire YMCA last week, where the director of our Children's Trust was decrying how there's such an increasingly high number of children and young people in care at the moment. And one practical outworking with all the responsibility and commitment it involves is to really encourage people to look at the Home for Good initiative and consider whether they could actually foster or adopt or provide supported lodgings.
really helpful. And we'll make sure that is put in the podcast descriptor as well for those that are interested in following along for Home for Good. We do encourage you to go and look further at that as a response as kind of what you're hearing and also your engagement, but also how you might encourage others to potentially as well. Thank you for that as well. So we touched a bit about the Hebrews reading there, and I wonder if we want to try to make a bit. Can we make a link, do you think, between the 1 Samuel reading and the Hebrews reading? Do you think that's possible, or as people that are thinking to preach, you think no, 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 we can't do that? What's some of our thoughts on that, Catriona? I wonder if you want to go first on that one. Is there thoughts you have? Can you make a Did you see any links between the readings, or do you think there's something different emerging?
I think for Hebrews, it's a letter of encouragement, I think,
Mm,
and we've just mentioned hope. Um, and I did jot down one of Walter Brueggemann's um, sentences. He's great at a sentence, isn't he?
mm,
Hope is the refusal to accept the reading of reality, which is the majority opinion. And one does that only at great political and existential risk. That's in the prophetic imagination. So something risky about hope. It's not some kind of, let's just sit here and wait till something changes. It's a kind of call to action. And in Hebrews, uh, seems to be the recipients have lost a bit of hope and lost a bit of courage, and are in need of reminding of what it's all about. But at the end, again, the things that I focused on were some tips on how to live together well, and one of them was just actually to meet, to come together. And I think some people would say, well, it's to go to church, and I would say, well, maybe that's not, perhaps it's to worship together, but it's simply to come together. I think it's what can you do unless you actually know each other as a community? Who are you? What can you do
mm,
if you don't even know each other? But the importance of knowing one another, and these, which sounds such a simple thing, but if you don't do that, it's very hard to take action and to support
Mm,
and
mm,
comfort,
mm,
and work in solidarity with one another for a better world.
mm.
mm, mm,
And to make a link, I think, to kind of when you were talking about your own kind of experience of your working life in terms of what you've been involved with both professionally and in voluntary, for both of you, it's about people, isn't it?
mm,
And at the heart of, and amongst all of it, are those things in which we covered about our most recent news and what's happening around the world, at the heart of kind of what does peace, reconciliation, and ultimately where does hope come from? I think it begins in the encounter of people, doesn't it? And the coming together of people potentially. That's easier said than done often, isn't it? Because we recognize that actually. To even get people in a room together sometimes can be the biggest challenge in
mm,
itself.
mm,
Some of the most profound experience I've found, even the life of the role I'm in right now is we are blessed to have the work at the St. Philip Centre in Leicester.
mm,
So big shout out to them, and they do great work of engaging with interfaith dialogue both in Leicester and afar across the nation. And some of the work we've been doing in particular around um, work for safeguarding. So talking about safeguarding in the context of interfaith communities, um, about domestic violence and abuse, and but in particular religious abuse as well. Actually having open conversations around what does that look like in our own context of religion, and that's a really hard conversation to have, but it happens, and it's only happened because we've been together in the room together and we've shared food together
Yeah.
and we've been open together, and that's allowed people to be vulnerable and open, and to have those very difficult but real conversations that's been so sorely needed. And it's not about finger pointing and blaming, it's about being open about what it is to be human and what it is to learn about what it is to be human and aim to have a hope for a better future. And I wonder if there's something about that of in that Hebrews passage that we see, which is a real encouragement right at the end, isn't it? To consider how we may spur one another toward love and good deeds. How does it look to spur one another on, but not just, of course, in our own, we can look in our own Christian bubble, can't we, maybe? But I think in that interfaith conversation, I wanted to bring you back in, Catriona, briefly before I come to you, Steve. But where have you seen it done well of spurring one another on in good deeds in an interfaith conversation, interreligious conversation? Where's that worked? Have you seen that work well? Has that been able? Have you been able to spur one another on in good deeds in that context? I wonder.
And yes, I think yes, it is. I've got to provoke one another to love
Mm,
and good
Mm.
deeds. So it's a kind of, it's not necessarily comfortable, I think is
yeah.
what I'm saying. Um, but to have that commitment to be curious about one another and to recognize the humanity in one another, and where does goodness dwell, where does God dwell, um, and to be open to change and open to understanding. And I think that's the heart of interreligious engagement is to be curious. It's not all boxed up just because somebody has a particular label. Um, and it's become, even though it's challenging, can become incredibly enjoyable and interesting, and you want to do it again. And I'm always in favor of things that are not just sort of pop-ups, just one encounter and then we pack up and go home, but say, well, let's do it again. Let's get to know each other a little better. Let's dig deeper into some of these things, and particularly some of the things that apparently divide us, or the things that we disagree about. That's interesting. Why do we disagree about that? Tell me more about why you why where did that come from? In your religious upbringing, in your religious grouping at the moment, where does that come from? Help me understand. And so long as I'm also prepared to do the same, what a rich conversation and great relationships I've still got. Yeah, I still have lots of good relationships with people that I have met over the years. And my son, I don't look like a football manager, but I have been one. When my son was about 13, 14, 15, we had a multi-faith football team.
Mm.
And my son is now, how old is he? I'm very bad at these things, 30, 31, something like that. He is in touch. He's coming back home for Christmas, and he's in touch with a whole load of those boys who played
Brilliant.
football
Brilliant.
all, 15, 16, 17 years ago.
Mm.
So and there were big conversations about what color should the strip be, because, colors and religion and, all that kind of stuff. Where should we go to eat after the match? But all those very heated conversations really brought that team together, and they're still friends now. So it is possible, and I would then go, another world is possible.
Absolutely. And it's amazing when you spend enough time together what you learn about one another as well. Because I'm sure Man United before not too long will need another football manager, and they might be calling you, Catriona. So now that you've made people aware that you've got football management experience, you can add that to another quiver in your bow, as they say. Steve, as well, reflections on that, but also kind of, is there any kind of illustrations or uh, is there things kind of to make it practical, or kind of points that you would kind of, if you were preaching on it, what would you say and
Yeah.
do, or kind of anything to help us land some of these big themes?
I mean, you both already mentioned it, and I'd just really emphasize you cannot undervalue just sitting together over food and having conversation. It's so important. You know, there's so many examples of that in the Gospels. And we have a distinctive ministry of church-related community work. The URC recognises that as a ministry of community development, and we've had our church-related community workers involved with the Grassroots project in Luton with Luton Interfaiths. There's wonderful stories involved, you know, in conversations, meeting around food in Luton. That's worth checking out. Blackburn and Darwin, the interfaith work up there again is exemplary, and we've had a church-related community worker involved with that. Have a look at the Interfaith Week website again. There's a sort of map there showing you the conversations and events that are going on there, and hopefully there's somewhere near you that you can engage with. So in a sense, it's as simple as that, but as complicated as Catriona has explored, you know, of just getting together and trying to build up relationships when so often nowadays in society, those natural places of meeting don't come together. So yeah, football teams, conversations in the playgrounds, you know, that they're the crucial meeting points where you can do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Encourage as you're thinking and reflecting on what your worshiping communities might be doing this coming weekend, wherever they might be, in whatever context it might be. I guess there's a real encouragement from our thread of conversation today to encourage there to be dialogue, encourage there to be
Mm.
that meaningful talk, an opportunity to do that well, and to do that in its broadest sense, in its inclusive sense of not just our own communities, but those communities that are on the margins, those communities that we so often overlook, that so often we don't even engage with potentially as well. And what does that look like, especially as we participate in Interfaith Week? And I just want to kind of raise awareness before I kind of get one last thoughts from both of you, kind of on our week's readings, but also just in general too. Just want to give a special mention, of course, of the COP29 again, just to reiterate the importance of that meeting and that dialogue, of course, in the context of our week's news and in the ongoing political conversation too. And again, the church leaders' statement that the Joint Public Issues team, of course, is a makeup of a number of denominations, and the Baptist Union, United Reformed Church, and the Methodist Church have come together on a joint statement for COP29, and we really want to encourage you to engage with what that statement looks like. But I'm going to read just a very brief kind of part of that statement, and the wider statement will be it's on the website on the Joint Public Issues team page, but also we'll put the link in the description of the podcast too. It says this: we join with faith communities across the world in calling for substantial additional funding for the Loss and Damage Fund. We support the principle that polluters should pay for the loss and damage. We want to see progress at Baku on new taxes and other sources of revenue to resource global action. I mean, that's a hope, isn't it? And there lies hope that we have as that meeting gathers in Baku and as our leaders continue in, we hope, purposeful and meaningful dialogue for change as well. So, lastly, friends, as we kind of come near to the end of our Politics in the Pulpit podcast, of course, we've not delved too much into our Mark reading at all. As I said, we might not have got to all of them, but there's so much richness in all the passages that we have here today in our lecture readings. But is there one final thought that we haven't had a chance to cover that you want to just share? Let's start with you, Catriona, and then we'll go to you, Steve. So, give us one final thought and reflection, maybe, that you want to offer, or you want to just point people to a certain resource or conversation.
I'll just what you were saying about COP29. I was reading a book by Bruno Latour um, on the environment and Christianity, and he calls it the slow, detailed apocalypse. Slow, detailed apocalypse. And so we've got sort of big, horrible things happening in the world at the moment, and our readings can relate to those very, wars and rumors of wars and all that kind of thing. And yet the environment and the climate crisis is there, and it's sometimes it's harder to to grab those slow, detailed things rather than the pow, immediate things. But it's absolutely crucial. And again, I would come back to the quality of discourse. And even when with high level peace negotiations, whether that's Sudan, in the Middle East, wherever, the quality of the discourse, the quality of the discourse around the environment, we need to understand deeply one another, and to, again, coming from our readings, to have courage and to have hope, and to sing out about the world that God intends.
Helpful. Absolutely, sing out a new song as well, isn't it? Steve, lastly to you, anything that you want to just share for us?
What a hard act to follow. Thank you
Yeah.
so much, Catriona. Maybe I was pondering there's a bit of a link between the three passages. The first, the pastoral focus and Hannah's story, the practical outworking and the enacted hope in the Hebrews 1, and yeah, the Mark passage we haven't spoken much about, but watch out that no one deceives you. Looking at the end times and where we might be there. So more the prophetic, pastoral, practical, and prophetic. Anne Morrissey, you may well know, she's a wise community theologian and practitioner. She's written many books beyond the Good Samaritan, but she wrote one about 15 years ago, which I think is still very relevant for today. Bothered and bewildered, enacted hope in troubled times. How do we enact the hope that lives inside us in our relationships with people in our streets and neighborhoods? And I think it's the way we demonstrate that practical outworking of God's love in action that is crucial. Literally, smiles in the streets, so important when there's so much division in society. It's how do we dare to encounter and build relationships with those who we perhaps wouldn't naturally think of, but it's so important that we do. You mentioned the Constituency Action Network, I think, in the last couple of podcasts. There are many MPs of faith, different faiths, no faith, that hopefully you're getting to know more about and to link with. And I had the pleasure of being part of a Churchworks meeting. Churchworks is worth checking out as well, their website, where Lord Wajid Khan, who's the Minister for Faith, Communities and Resettlement in the new government, was very quick to applaud and to thank all the works and relationships across the faiths and with faith-based organisations. And I know he wants to come and visit places. So again, why not ask him to come and visit your church community presence and engagement that you're up to?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you to you both for your contributions. We've had a bit of Brueggemann, some football manager conversation, and indeed a three-piece sermon to finish off. So what a delight it has been for us to be able to have this conversation of politics in the pulpit here today. And I hope as you've listened, we've kind of just whetted your appetite for politics in the pulpit. We've helped you engage with these scriptures, and we want to help you continue to engage those scriptures even more so in the coming weeks, as well as we head into, dare I say, Advent is just on the horizon. So my goodness, we want to continue to offer hope in that season of time. So to do that, please do subscribe to our podcast, Politics in the Pulpit. That way you receive the latest episode of Politics in the Pulpit into wherever you get your podcasts from. So we'd love to be able to continue to offer you this lectionary-based preaching resource brought to you by the Joint Public Issues team to help encourage you and inspire you. But once again, Catriona and Steve, thank you so much for joining us today for this latest episode, and we look forward to hopefully having you back on the podcast down the line. But bless you both, and bless you for listening to us as you continue to engage with politics in the pulpits. Bye for now.